Central African Republic is facing the worst kind of ethno-religious violence. Almost 1 million people, 1/5 of the country, are displaced, and half the country's population requires humanitarian aid. We'll talk about the ongoing conflict and the fears of the international community next on The Line. This is On The Line, and I'm Aisha Tanzim. Central African Republic has often been the playground of regional and international players in a battle for resources. The last year has seen this battle turn into a conflict along ethnic and religious lines. Our guests will help us understand exactly what is happening in this small African nation and what is the international community doing. Our guest is Dr. Peter Pham. He is the director of the Africa Center at the Atlantic Council. Dr. Pham, welcome to On The Line.
Thank you for having me.
Now, when I say ethnic and religious lines in CAR, Central African Republic, I mean the minority Muslim community and the majority Christian community. But this conflict did not start out as a religious conflict. How did it turn into one?
Well, this is a country that, despite the great potential wealth from its natural resources, timber, cotton, minerals under the ground, possibly even petroleum.
Diamonds.
Yes. Has never really gotten the development because it never really formed and coalesced into a real state. The country's now has had 7 heads of state, and of the 7, only 1 was regularly elected in what could be called a reasonably fair and free election. So institutions were never built. Last year, around March, a leader from the minority Muslim community, a fellow named Michel Chitodia, marched on the Capitol despite a peace agreement, seized power from the then president, Francois Bozize, who himself, by the way, didn't have clean hands, having seized power from his predecessor in a coup, seized power, deposed the president, and set himself up as the president. He then turned, and these fighters who brought him to power, the so-called Seleka, or coalition fighters, he didn't have a means to pay them. So he basically turned them loose on the Capitol and said, pay yourself, grab what you can. And they engaged in an orgy of violence, looting, rape, and in some cases murder. Fast forward a little bit. In the fall, for whatever reasons of his own, Michel Chitodia felt himself comfortable enough that he could dismiss these fighters who brought him to power. They then looted their way out of the city. And then subsequently, the population rose up, formed local self-protection groups known in the local dialect as anti-Balaka, anti-machete forces, and then eventually drove the international community to remove him from power, force him to resign.
And let me just mention anti-machete because the Seleka used to carry machete. Is that why they're
Yes, they used to carry machete. These are poor land. We're not talking about sophisticated war-fighting capability. We're talking about very much low-intensity but brutal violence. So
at this point, is it completely on religious lines, or the ethnic differences are also playing a part? In other words, do we have some Christian tribes on the Seleka side, vice versa, or is it completely divided?
It's predominantly divided along, but religion really has never been a factor. Christians and Muslims have, for literally centuries, lived peacefully side by side in the Central African Republic. Ironically, some of the first victims of the Seleka when they were looting were actually religiously Muslim businessmen and merchants who themselves were looted. However, unfortunately, things have gotten very desperate and religion has become a proxy for other things. I might point out there are some very stellar examples within the CAR of religious leaders who've been, on both sides, who've been trying to speak out and in fact show by their own example that Christians and Muslims can live together. The Roman Catholic Archbishop of Bangui, Monsignor Dieudonné Nzapalainga, for example, during the worst of the violence in December, hid the chief imam of the country, Imam Umar Kobini Layame, in his own house and protected him and his family from the violence going on around.
Since you're talking about Bangui, the mayor of Bangui, a woman named Catherine Samba-Panza, was recently selected, I wouldn't say elected, selected as the transitional president of the country. Has she made any difference?
Well, she's a very polished woman, educated in France, very used to dealing with the international community. So she sounded all the right notes. But one has to look a little bit into the background. This is a woman who hails from the political elites who have not done much for the Central African Republic in the last 50 years. Her husband, for example, Syriac, has served not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 or more times as a cabinet minister in 2 different governments headed by men who seize power through violence. So this is a family with not necessarily the cleanest of hands, even if she's sounding the right notes.
And this Transitional National Council, or National Transitional Council as they say it there, the 135 members, is it also a party that everybody has confidence in, or do you think that its performance has also been a suspect?
I think the National Transitional Council is being used cynically by the international community for want of something else to use to get a process going. It was appointed, none of the members were elected. They were handpicked by the recently removed Seleka leader, Michel Chitodia, because when he took power, he couldn't trust the parliament that existed because it was predominated by people loyal to the man he deposed. So he went about picking his hand-picked 135, and so these were the people who then turned around and elected the new president. So in that sense, there's the old computer term garbage in, garbage out, and unfortunately this is what we have in a questionably legitimate council electing by whatever right they assume for themselves a new president. It's going to be a dicey situation.
So we've right now explained the background of what's happening. I want to discuss what's happening right now on the ground, but also what the international community is doing at this point. But we need to take a short break. We'll be right back.
Voice of America. 1,500 hours
of news and information.
Educational and cultural programming.
To more than 134 million people
worldwide each week.
Listen to us on radio.
Watch us on television.
Follow us on Facebook or Twitter.
And through your mobile device.
VOA.
We're dynamic
and consistent
in bringing you
the most reliable information in 43 languages.
Tune in.
Tune in.
Welcome back to On the Line. I'm Aisha Tanseem. We are talking about the crisis in Central African Republic. Our first guest is Dr. Peter Pham, Director of the Africa Center at the Atlantic Council, and our second guest, Emira Woods from the Institute for Policy Studies, has just joined us. I welcome Emira Woods to On the Line. We were discussing with Dr. Pham the background of what has happened. But Ms. Woods, please tell us, what is the international community doing at this point?
Well, I think the international community in the Central African Republic is focused on trying to stem the violence, to try to bring in peacekeepers, and also trying to deal with a humanitarian catastrophe. So there is a French force sanctioned by the UN, but still a French force that is in place.
But only 2,000 of them, though.
Right. There are also African Union forces that are in place. And so there is attention paid on the peacekeeping end. But clearly there is much needed attention for a broader set of comprehensive strategies that will lead to not only a cessation of the crisis, but really a long-term resolution of a political crisis in the Central African Republic.
Do you think there are enough forces in there right now?
Well, I think there's a lot of attention on forces. Clearly, what is needed is African Union forces to be reinforced, but to be rehatted to United Nations troops, right? So clearly, the African Union is good at crisis response, the emergency responders. But this is a long-term protracted crisis. So what is needed is the United Nations to have a long-term peacekeeping mission in the Central African Republic, to not get bogged down by particularly a former colonial power asserting its own more unilateral efforts at negotiating a way through this crisis. What is needed is the UN and all of the facets of the UN, not only the peacekeeping, but also the UN negotiators that will be able to lead to a path where the people of the Central African Republic can actually determine their own future, a future that's not mired in, again, whether it's religious or this short-term analysis of the crisis now.
Dr. Pham, what the UN is doing very little from some of what I've read. What else do you think needs to be done?
Well, first of all, the peacekeeping force, although Emira doesn't want to emphasize, and I agree with her, there has to be a broad base where the peacekeeping force is totally inadequate. We're talking about a country larger than France itself geographically, and yet the French have put in 2,000 troops. The African Union has never met the quota of the previous authorized force. The quota has been raised. They're nowhere closer to meeting that. To rehatting them changes the color of someone's hat, maybe get some funding streams, but still the force is inadequate. They're barely able to maintain a modicum, and I wouldn't say total, modicum of control in Bangui, the capital, much less extending that beyond the perimeters of the city. So we have to establish basic security, and no one's even contemplating the size of the force needed. Secondly, they have to diagnose the problem correctly. The problem is not, when you talk about genocide, which is a great alarmist term to be used, it sensationalizes, gets you attention, but a genocide is an organized attempt to eliminate, in whole or in part, a predetermined group of people. We don't have a genocide here. We have massive violence, but it's occurring at a very low level, unfortunately, neighbor to neighbor, tragically at a very low level. That needs policing, not military force. But when you talk genocide, you end up with a military force and rather than police. And then thirdly, we need, and I agree here with my dear friend, we need the entire spectrum of responses. This is a crisis that needs a political solution, and that can only be achieved with time for the Central Africans themselves to come up with what they want of their country and then to move forward.
Let's talk about the regional players here, because Ms. Woods, CAR has always been a playground for some of the regional players. Who are some of the most important ones right now?
Well, I think we have to underscore that Central African Republic, even though it's pitted as this quote-unquote poor country, is in fact well endowed with natural resources, whether it's gold or diamonds, uranium, and now more recently oil. So there are a lot of interests at stake. And I think what is alarming is what some see as a real nefarious role being played by some of the neighbors. You know, Chad on one side, Sudan on the other. You know, it's a difficult neighborhood, and some of the neighbors may be meddling for reasons that may increase the propensity to violence and to conflict, as opposed to reducing that. So I think we have to, we have to be worried individual action from any one of those neighbors, and really instead encourage a more African Union, a collective response by the African Union that's taking a broader picture in terms of what's happening in Central African Republic.
I apologize for interrupting. Both of you mentioned an African Union response, a broader response. What is it that's stopping the African Union from sending in, for example, more troops? Is it, Dr. Pham, just resources?
It's a combination of resources, and we don't want to just send bodies into a conflict. They need to be well-trained forces, and for all the talk, and it's now over a decade of talk about an African standby force, the fact is, for many African countries, independence, sovereignty is so new, so precious, that it's very difficult to overcome that desire to have my own force rather than pooling resources. Think of how long it took Europe to begin to pool its resources into the European Union. There's still lots of hiccups along the way. The African Union is only a little over a decade old, so it's taking a little bit of time. So one has to also be realistic about what one can expect overnight. But I think there's a lack of political will as well. Some of those who want to go in have, as Amira pointed out, ulterior motives that are suspect. Those who are farther off wonder why they want to send their forces and put them at risk in a place that's long from their interest. So there's a tension between interest and detachment, and that's a constant tension.
Ms. Woods, why is it that French are the only ones from the international community that are willing to send? Yes, they're an old colonial power and they have interests in the region, but China, for example, has interest in Africa. America has a huge interest in Africa and a lot of focus on Africa. Why is it that we don't see forces from other players?
Well, in fact, there are U.S. forces there. We had U.S. forces going in to...
Very few, though.
So-called search for Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army in Central African Republic, and we really don't know what the numbers are. We do know that there are U.S. private military contractors as well as military advisors that are there. So there are interests there, and they are involved, whether it's in facilitating airlifts or what have you. They have have been playing a role. I think clearly, again, we have to underscore that there is attention being paid increasingly now to the peacekeeping. But really, stability will not come to the Central African Republic unless those broader issues, those underlying issues are addressed. Since 1960, when the Central African Republic gained independence, there's been one election, one opportunity for people to choose their leaders freely.
How do you pay attention to those issues without first stopping the violence? If neighbors are killing neighbors or tribes are killing tribes, you need to first stop that, and for that you need peacekeeping forces.
Well, I think you need a combination. You need to lift up, most importantly, the voices of those who are the faith-based leaders, the civil society organizations, the women's groups leaders that are reaching out to rebuild, in spite of all odds, the social fabric. They're there. They're active. There are imams. There are bishops and church leaders that are involved trying to reach across the divides. So we need to hold up those voices. We need to include them in a process that's going to lead to a comprehensive resolution of this crisis.
Do you see, Dr. Pham, that there's at least a process or an effort, however rudimentary, to include those voices that Ms. Woods is talking about?
Well, I think we know the prescription that's needed, which is that broad-based, inclusive dialogue. We also know that it takes time and resources, and this is where our difficulty is. We really know how to fix it. We know how to create the space for Central Africans to be empowered and to take control of their own country for the first time, really. The real question is, does the international community have the political will and the willingness to spend capital, including financial capital, in this mission in a place where, unfortunately, many people have not heard of, don't see a direct interest, and that's the difficulty. We know how to fix this problem. We know what can be done, what the best practices are. It's the question of international community and its political will or lack thereof.
Well, let's be honest. International community has been very hesitant getting involved with anything that involves them spending money. I'm just wondering, with all the resources in Central African Republic, could it be an incentive for the international community to bring peace to the country so that those resources can then be used?
Well, ultimately, that's what's needed. The resources must be used in the interest of the people. And for far too long, they have served mining interests, other interests external to the Central African Republic. So ultimately, you need an environment where the economy benefits the people, where the political process is inclusive, where people are no longer feeling like they have to act out in violent retributions to be able to basically have a meaningful life. So I think it is those steps that are needed to have a firm path to peace now.
So, Dr. Pham, in an ideal world, people should do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, but that's not how things happen. So when peace is brought to Central African Republic, could it be enough of an enticement for the international community? Could it be something that can lure them in to come and help?
I'd like to believe so. I'd like to hope so. But realistically, with a 50-year history of bad governance, lack of institutions, it's going to take a few years of good governance to begin to win the confidence of investors. As Emira said, and I mentioned earlier, this is a country with tremendous resources. But who in their right mind is going to sink hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, into a place that's so uncertain, where a president can be replaced because someone else gathers up a mob with machetes and runs into the Capitol? No one's going to make an investment there. Let's be realistic. And that's the type of capital-intensive investment one needs to begin to generate the type of resources this country needs to develop. So unfortunately, I think we have to be realistic and say that this isn't going to come overnight. It's going to require time and a bit of patience. And the real question thus remains, does the international community, is it willing, are enough stakes there to make that commitment? And I'd like to think so, but I'm skeptical.
Ms. Woods, do you see any commitment from the international community?
Well, I think the investors have been there. I think that's the issue. They're there for short-term extraction of the resources, not for long-term commitment to benefiting the people, to improving the condition of people's lives on the ground. So I think ultimately this has been a wake-up call to the people of Central African Republic, and they ultimately will determine what comes next, to what extent they're able to get beyond this year and a half of chaos, to be able to regain regain a firmer footing towards...
Do you have, you see what's going on. Do you have hope that they will be able to get over what's going on right now?
I am always hopeful. You know, when you see a National Assembly as flawed as it was, coming out with a real consensus leader, you know, I mean, I feel like we have to say, well,
the mayor of
I'm sorry, Amira. A consensus leader whose husband served 2 different military coup leaders as a minister, not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 times, who's part and parcel of the political elite. Let's not get engaged in wishful thinking.
Well, I think we have to say this is a long-term issue, right? So there will be some short-term gains, and we can say, yes, people were able to come together to say the coup leaders have to leave. They left, which is extraordinary, right? And that there is, okay, a transition period with a transition
because they didn't
leader.
have any machetes behind them anymore? They
well,
disbanded?
I think you constantly have flows of weapons into countries that can continue to perpetuate the violence. I think there's a sense where people are saying enough is enough, and that was clear in the Central African Republic in December, which brought about a change. I think the push for change will continue to come from
So you're
those
hopeful.
sectors.
Very quickly, 20 seconds, Dr. Pham. She's hopeful.
Unfortunately, it wasn't the people of the Central African Republic who rose up. It was the neighboring countries who chucked Michel Chitodia out, and then the election of his successor was by an assembly appointed by him. So I don't see the voices being heard here.
Okay, well, thank you very much. This is a very complicated affair, and we all hope for the best for the country, but we don't know when help is going to come. But I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. I want to thank our guests, Dr. Peter Pham, Director of the Africa Center at the Atlantic Council, and Emira Woods from the Institute for Policy Studies. And thank you for joining us. Please send us your questions or comments or watch our past shows on our website, voanews.com/ontheline. We look forward to hearing from you and hope you'll join us again next week for another episode of On the Line.
To landmarks. When speaking of landmarks, they come no bigger nor greater than this one, Mount Everest, the tallest mountain on planet Earth. Revered by all who see it, Everest stands 8,048 metres tall, or 29,029 feet, and straddles both the ancient kingdoms of Nepal and Tibet. Its status as the roof of the world heightened the desire of many to conquer its peak. When asked why he wanted to make the climb, George Mallory, who was later to perish on its summit, said, "Because it's there." So when New Zealander Sir Edmund Hillary and his Sherpa guide Tenzing Norgay completed the once thought impossible by reaching a summit in 1953, their feat captured the imagination of the world and made them heroes. Their success changed the lives of many, including the native Sherpas who have lived below the shadows of Everest for centuries. Nearly 30,000 tourists now visit Nepal every year. In Nepal, where most of the people are subsistence farmers, the annual income per capita is about $1,500 a year. Sherpas who work in the tourism industry can earn 5 times as much. As a result, Sherpas now do less of the heavy lifting on the trail. A Sherpa will organise and lead the trek, but the bulky gear is usually carried by a less well-paid porter. Their strength, experience, calm and congenial demeanour make them ideal companions for climbers. Many tourists say it still seems like hard work by Western standards.
It's very hard to become a guide, actually. We should do lots of struggle, like we have to carry a heavy load. As a porter, we should do as a porter as well at the beginning of the job, you know.
But for many of the Sherpa people, it's a way of life regarded as a gift from the gods. So Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay. Sherpas own most of the 400+ lodges in the Khumbu region, where Mount Everest stands, and many of the companies that organise the treks in Kathmandu. Many villages in Khumbu enjoy some of the modern conveniences made possible by the Sherpas' success. Growth in the region has not only improved the standard of living in many villages, but it has helped commerce flourish. Sherpas walk for days from many different villages in the south up to Namche Bazaar, a prosperous Sherpa village, an important trading centre for the Saturday market. There is concern that as Sherpas leave Khumbu for even better opportunities, they will leave part of their culture behind as well. A population of only about 10,000 Sherpas remains in Khumbu. In the villages, many Sherpas still make an effort to preserve their traditions and to pass them on to younger generations. In Kumjang, villagers wearing traditional costumes hold a number of ceremonies just before the rainy season to pray for a good season for their crops, and they still hold deeply religious faith which promotes the Buddhist idea of compassion for all human beings. Not far from Kumjang, prayer flags swirl in the wind, gracing spectacular mountainsides nearly 30 years after they were first raised. The flags fly for the souls of over 200 climbers who have died trying to reach the summit. For many, conquering Everest is a magnificent obsession, but to others, it can also be an unforgiving reminder of the respect nature demands.
Would-be pilots tested their wings on homemade flying machines on a beach in California. Hi, I'm VOA producer Dion Moses.
And I'm West Coast Bureau Chief Mike O'Sullivan. We recently reported on a competition called National Red Bull Flugtag Day.
There's some thrills and spills. Check this out.
Get ready, get set, fly.
I just came out here because it looks like it'd be awesome. It looks really funny and exciting.
More than 25 teams participated in National Red Bull Flugtag Day, sponsored by a company that makes an energy drink.
Flugtag is German for flying day, and we build flying contraptions and push them off a 30-foot ramp into Rainbow Harbor here at Long Beach.
Yeah, it's crazy. I'm hoping that they crash, so it's more fun.
The water impact was quicker and harder than I expected, but it was definitely fun, definitely worth it, and that's all that really mattered.
Teams are judged on flight distance, creativity, and showmanship by a panel of sports celebrities.
It's cool to finally be here. I heard it's just such a great event to see, like a lot of laughs and a lot of carnage.
The world record for these homemade flying machines was set in Germany with a distance of 70 meters.
I thought the takeoff was our most dangerous part, so once that was done, I was feeling pretty good about it. We flew 258 feet. We had so much adrenaline up there, I'm still like shaking, but it felt really awesome. It'd be fun to do it again. We're gonna have to sleep a little bit first though.
For shattering the Flugtag world record, Laura and her teammates will receive a skydiving trip as the competitors recover from their bruises. Mike O'Sullivan, VOA News, Long Beach, California.